Thank you for choosing to watch this Norton College History video blog. This is the first in a brand new series of video blogs covering the revolutions in Russia and all the great history that happened between 1881 and 1954. So the focus of this video blog is all about what caused the 1905 revolution. As you can see, in 1905 it was a huge year in Russian history. We saw a series of revolutionary events which led to the Tsar of Russia issuing the October Manifesto, where the Tsar was forced to concede powers, including the creation of a Duma, which was a Russian parliament. Interestingly enough, back in 1895, members of the Zemstva had wanted to share power with the Tsar, but the Tsar had dismissed their request as senseless dreams. And yet, 10 years later, the Tsar was backed into a corner and had to concede these powers in October 1905 when he issued the October Manifesto. So the question is, why? What caused the 1905 revolution? Now, most historians agree that it's a contributory factors of long-term problems in Russia, such as the growth of reformist groups, like the Social Democrats, the Social Revolutionaries, and other liberal groups that were formed around that time. And also the long-term factor of instability in Russia, the autocratic rule and repression as characterised in the reigns of Alexander III and also in the reign of Nicholas II. However, 1905 is characterised by two very important events. The development of the Russo-Japanese War, which had started as an aggressive imperial war in 1904, and the events of the 22nd of January 1905 that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. So, our first cause that we're going to look at is the growth of reformist groups in Russia in 1905. Now, before 1905, we'd seen the spread of lots of different new ideas, but political parties in Russia were actually banned, and the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, had made sure that these reformist groups did not become too powerful. These reformist groups can be split into two main categories. There were the groups that were revolutionaries, and they're characterised by the Social Democrats and the Social Revolutionaries, and the groups that were more reformist. Now, the groups, the Octobrists and the Cadets, were not actually formed until the end of 1905, but the ideas of the liberal movement had quite an important long-term factor to play in the 1905 revolution. The reformist groups like the Octobrists and Cadets would come to be dominated by more middle-class Russians, perhaps factory owners, that wanted to help the Tsar run the country. Other groups, such as the Social Democrats and the Social Revolutionaries, wanted to work against the Tsar, and their aim was the complete overthrow of the Tsar. The Social Democrats themselves in 1903 split up into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. However, the Social Democrats tended to concentrate on the workers, believing that a revolution would come from worker protests, whereas the Social Revolutionaries tended to focus on the peasants, believing the fact that 80% of the Russian population were peasants would see the peasants as the main group which could overthrow the Tsar. So these revolutionary groups had an important part to play in the 1905 revolution, but most historians would argue that their role has been overplayed. And in fact, these revolutionary groups came into play much more after 1905 and had much more of an impact in 1917. Of course, these revolutionary groups had caused chaos throughout the late 19th century. We could see that in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, when he was assassinated by the revolutionary group The People's Will. We also saw a period of assassinations organised by the Social Revolutionaries, including Minister of the Interior Plevs in 1904, and of course the Tsar's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, was assassinated in February 1905. However, I would argue that the growth of reformist groups is perhaps not as an important factor as more long-term problems in Russia which revolved around the autocracy. So that comes on to the next key reason why there was a 1905 revolution. And that's because there are a number of different factors that caused long-term instability in Russia. Firstly, Russia had a backwards agrarian economy. This meant that Russia was unable to keep up with its Western competitors, namely countries like Britain and France. And therefore this led to instability in Russia because Russia was always worried about fighting wars with the West. The defeat of Russia in the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, had been what had originally prompted Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, to bring in the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. However, this was a piecemeal reform, as it brought in the very unpopular redemption payments, which had caused long-term anger and unhappiness from the peasants, especially as these redemption payments would take a whole 49 years to pay off. It's no surprise that was a key aspect within the 1905 revolution and a key grievance of both the workers and the peasants. Rapid industrialisation had been characterised by a succession of finance ministers, Nikolai Bungi, Ivan Vishnegradsky, and of course our good friend Count Sergei Witte, where industrialisation was so rapid in the era of Witte being finance minister from 1892 until 1903 that this period in Russian history is known as the Great Spurt. However, this economic modernisation was not characterised by political modernisation at the same time, and this led to very poor living and working conditions where workers were working in very, very large factories, often with over 1,000 workers, with hardly any kind of legislation to govern what working conditions were like. Factory workers were frequently working 11, 12-hour days, and their living conditions were terrible. Combined to this, with this rapid industrialisation, we had a new middle class that wanted a share of political power, and of course, as previously mentioned, in 1895 some of these middle class Russians had wanted to share power with the Tsar, having already tasted a slice of power through the Zemstva, which had been created by Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, in 1870. Nicholas II foolishly had dismissed these aims as senseless dreams. Long-term problems in the agricultural economy led to famines in 1892, 1898 and 1901 and led to jacqueries, which are a word for peasant uprising. In summary, the autocratic rule frustrated the Russian people, and it wasn't helped by the fact that Tsar Nicholas II himself was quite a weak ruler. He was no match for Alexander III, his father, a 6'4" tall, very strong autocratic ruler whose hobby was bending horseshoes. I think, therefore, what Tsar Nicholas II shows is that to be a really good autocrat, you needed to have the strong personality to go with it. Meanwhile, in the 1890s, literacy levels in Russia had increased, exposing more Russian people to reformist ideas from the West. This all created a kind of cocktail or soup of social and economic conditions to create the 1905 revolution. Therefore, I would argue that this was a more important long-term problem than the growth of reformist groups. However, there was nothing to trigger the actual 1905 revolution, and this is where the two short-term trigger become really, really important. So here you can see a Russian peasant, I've named him Igor, very, very unhappy with the state of Russia in 1905. However, something needs to happen to prompt him to become a rebel, to prompt him to get involved in a Russia. These events, of course, did come. In 1904, Russia went to war with Japan. It had thought that Japan was an inferior country and that success in the war would be pretty much straightforward. Tsar Nicholas II hoped that a quick defeat of Japan would give him a popularity boost and present him to both his people and the world as a strong leader. However, the Russo-Japanese War went terribly wrong for Tsar Nicholas II. His attempt to actually defeat Japan ended in humiliating defeat. In January 1905, they had to surrender Port Arthur Naval Base in northern China, and then Japanese forces, Russian forces, were defeated within Manchuria. However, the biggest defeat came on the 27th of May 1905, where there was a huge defeat at Tsushima. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed pretty much halfway around the world, and they lost 25 of their 35 warships. This was a really important factor in the 1905 revolution because it made the people extremely angry. Plus, there was the factor that whilst the Russo-Japanese War was going on, a lot of the Russian army were actually fighting out in Japan and therefore were not within Russia and the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg to protect the Tsar and to support the autocracy. However, what I would argue was probably a more important trigger of Bloody Sunday. Here we can see Father Georgy Gapon, and we can see some of the struggles that happened outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Because despite all the problems in Russia, people still regarded the Tsar as their little father. They saw him as a father figure who they could look up to. And they didn't actually blame the Tsar himself for all the problems in Russia. You can see from the texting of the workers' petition here in white, the reference to the word "O Sire" and "we beg you" and "as our ruler," that the Russian people pretty much accepted the Tsar as their autocratic ruler. And they thought, probably foolishly, that the Tsar would be able to sort out their problems. In fact, the workers that were protesting at Bloody Sunday were led by Father Georgy Gapon, a Russian Orthodox priest. They were unarmed and hymn-singing protesters, but the Tsar's army, his forces, misjudged the situation terribly. They fired on the protesters, and 800 were injured and 200 were killed. And of course the rumours abounded at the time said that many, many more had been killed. This was a hugely important event in triggering the 1905 revolution, because the people began to stop seeing the Tsar as their little father, and they started to turn on the Tsar himself. Previously to that, they blamed all the problems on maybe the Tsar's advisors or members of the civil service. But now the Tsar was personally to blame. And this heralded a huge spiral in all the problems in Russia in 1905. This led to lots and lots of problems in the 1905 revolution. So in any essay that you have about what caused the 1905 revolution, you need to be able to give your own opinion. Was it the long-term problems that were the most important? Or was it the short-term issues, such as Bloody Sunday and the Russia-Japanese War, that caused the 1905 revolution? This is how the 1905 revolution developed. After the events of Bloody Sunday, and you have to remember that the Russia-Japanese War was going on throughout 1905, ending with a huge defeat of the Russian Baltic fleet in Tsushima in May 1905, you could see that strikes were developing throughout Russia. There were jackeries, peasant uprising, mutinies where forces refused to obey orders, and the workers actually organising themselves by setting up Soviets, an institution which would become very important in the 1917 revolutions, and ending only with the issuing of the October Manifesto, where the Tsar had to grant to his people a Duma, a Russian parliament. Hugely revolutionary events in 1905, only 11 years into the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, and of course you need to decide what you think was the most important cause of the 1905 revolution. I very much hope that you've enjoyed listening to this Norton College History video blog and that you've learnt something from it. Of course, if you have any questions, then please see any of the teachers in the history department. Thank you for your time, thank you for your enthusiasm, thank you for your energy, thank you for your verve, thank you for listening.